The buzz started the moment Reverend Thomas Whitmore stepped through the arched doorway of St. Michael's Lutheran Church on the morning of Sunday, September 13th, 1970. It wasn't the warm hum of organ pipes or the pleasant murmur of early arrivals. This was mechanical, insistent, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the worn floorboards and into the hollow of your chest. Because what begins as background noise can become the only thing you hear. The storm had torn through Morgantown, West Virginia, the night before. A savage late summer squall that stripped shingles from roofs and sent trash cans tumbling down Miller Avenue like aluminum dice. By dawn, the clouds had scattered, leaving the air thick and still, smelling of wet oak and split ozone. Whitmore arrived early to survey the damage. The sanctuary itself had survived intact. Stained glass unbroken, pews in their rows, the brass cross above the altar gleaming in the pale light that filtered through high windows. But as he walked the center aisle, testing each plank for storm damage, he heard it. A low, steady drone rising from beneath the floorboards. He crouched near the fourth pew and pressed his palm flat against the wood. The vibration traveled up his wrist. By 9:30 a.m., the congregation had begun to gather. Whitmore greeted them at the door. Handshakes, polite nods. But he noticed several parishioners pause mid-step as they entered, heads tilting, eyes narrowing. Mrs. Eleanor Cant, the church secretary, stopped him in the vestibule. "Thomas," she said quietly, "do you hear that?" He nodded. "Since this morning. I think something in the basement, maybe a busted pipe or the furnace acting up." She frowned. "The furnace isn't on. It's 70 degrees outside." The service began at 10 a.m. sharp. Whitmore stood at the pulpit and opened with the invocation, but his voice felt thin against the persistent hum rising from below. The congregation shifted in their seats. Hymnbooks were opened to page 83, Holy, Holy, Holy. But when the organist struck the first chord, the sound seemed to clash with the vibration underfoot, creating a dissonance that made teeth ache. Voices faltered. By the second verse, half the choir had stopped singing. Then the candles began to melt. It was Harold Fisher, seated in the third row, who noticed first. He leaned toward his wife and pointed. The twin pillar candles flanking the altar, thick white columns that had burned steadily through 100 services, were softening, wax pooling at their bases and dripping onto the brass holders. But the sanctuary was cool. No draft, no heat source. Whitmore watched, transfixed, as the flames guttered and the wax ran like tears down pale cheeks. Someone in the back pew stood and left without a word. "Where are you watching this from? What time is it where you are right now?" Drop a comment below, and if this story has already gotten under your skin, hit that like button and subscribe. You're going to want to see where this goes. By 10:45 a.m., the hum had grown louder, not in volume, but in presence, as though it were filling the empty spaces between words. Whitmore tried to continue with the sermon, but his notes felt irrelevant. He glanced at the hymn books stacked on the pew ledges and noticed something impossible. The pages were curling inward, edges folding over one another as though drying in invisible heat. He picked one up. The paper was bone dry, brittle. When he tried to open it to a marked page, the book resisted, the spine creaking, the leaves pressed tight as if glued shut. "Reverend," called a voice from the left side of the nave. It was Martin DeWitt, a deacon standing near the wall. "There's something wrong with the air." Whitmore stepped down from the pulpit and moved toward him. As he approached, he saw it, a faint shimmer rising from the iron grate set into the floor near the side door. The grate covered the old coal chute that led down to the basement, a space used for storage and rarely visited. The shimmer was subtle, like heat distortion above summer asphalt, but the air around it felt cold. DeWitt knelt and touched the grate. His hand jerked back. It's freezing. Whitmore crouched beside him and peered through the iron slats. The darkness below was absolute, but it wasn't empty. There was a glow, faint and sickly, the color of pond scum under moonlight. Pale green, pulsing. The congregation had gone silent. 43 people sat frozen in their pews, watching. Whitmore stood slowly. Everyone stay here. He crossed to the small door at the rear of the sanctuary, the one that led to the cramped stairwell descending into the basement. His hand rested on the iron latch. The hum was loudest here, so close it felt like language, not words, but intention. He opened the door. The glow spilled up the stairs, washing the walls in that pale, wrong light. The air smelled of copper and damp soil, and something else, something sweet and rotting. Whitmore took one step down. The buzzing sharpened, splitting into layered tones, harmonics that shouldn't exist. Then he saw the trapdoor. It sat at the base of the stairwell, a wooden square set flush with the concrete floor. He'd walked over it 100 times, never thinking twice. Just old access to the church's original foundation, sealed decades ago. But now the edges glowed, light leaking through the seams like something alive was trying to push through from below. Whitmore climbed back up. He closed the door. He locked it. And when he turned to face the congregation, his voice was steady, but his hands were not. Service is over. Everyone go home. No one asked why. 3 men stood in the church parking lot under a sky that refused to darken, though the clock read 7:30 p.m. Because some decisions can't be unmade, and some doors shouldn't need 3 men to keep them closed. Reverend Whitmore had sent the congregation home that morning with instructions to tell no one what they'd seen, or heard, or felt. Most had obeyed. But by Monday afternoon, rumors had begun to circulate through Morgantown like smoke under a door. The church secretary, Mrs. Cant, had fielded 11 phone calls asking if services would resume on Wednesday evening. She told each caller the same thing. The building needs inspection. We'll let you know. But Whitmore wasn't waiting for an inspection. He'd spent Sunday night at his kitchen table with a bottle of rye and a stack of parish records dating back to 1892, searching for any mention of the basement, the trapdoor, the foundation work. The whiskey stayed untouched. The records yielded nothing. By Monday evening, he'd made his decision. He called Martin DeWitt and Harold Fisher, both deacons, both men who'd served the church for decades, both men who wouldn't ask questions until after the work was done. They met in the parking lot at 7:30 p.m., the September heat finally breaking into a cool wind that carried the smell of cut grass and distant rain. "You sure about this?" Fisher asked. He was a broad man, 62 years old, hands scarred from 30 years working the lumber mill on Route 19. Whitmore nodded. "We open it? We look. We close it. That's all." DeWitt shifted his weight, a flashlight hanging loose in his grip. "And if we don't like what we see, then we nail it shut and forget it was ever there." The 3 men entered through the side door, avoiding the main sanctuary. The building felt different at night. Larger somehow, the shadows deeper than they had any right to be. The hum was still present, though quieter now. A low thrum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. They descended the narrow stairwell, their footsteps echoing on concrete. The trapdoor waited. It was roughly 4 feet square, made of oak planks blackened with age, iron handles bolted to either side. No lock, no markings. Just the seams glowing faintly in the beam of DeWitt's flashlight. That same pale green luminescence, weaker now, but unmistakable. Whitmore knelt and gripped one handle. Fisher took the other. They pulled. The door didn't budge. They tried again, harder this time, muscles straining. The wood groaned but held fast, as though sealed from below. DeWitt crouched beside them and ran his fingers along the edges. "It's not locked," he said. "It's just heavy, like there's pressure on the other side." Whitmore stood and wiped his palms on his trousers. "Get the crowbar from the tool shed." Fisher returned 5 minutes later with a 3-foot steel pry bar. He wedged it into the seam and leaned his weight against it. The wood creaked. The glow brightened. And then, with a sudden crack that echoed through the basement, the seal broke. The door flew open. The air that rushed out was cold, so cold that their breath misted in the flashlight beams. It carried that same copper and rot smell, but stronger now, mixed with something chemical, like burnt plastic or melted rubber. The 3 men stood frozen, staring down into the hole. It wasn't a crawl space or a shallow recess. It was a shaft, smooth-walled, descending at least 20 feet into darkness. And the walls weren't concrete. They were something else, something that reflected the flashlight beams in jagged, crystalline patterns. The glow came from below, pulsing slowly, rhythmically, like a heartbeat. The earth should not breathe. DeWitt aimed his flashlight down the shaft. The beam caught something at the bottom, a shape, geometric, too precise to be natural. He adjusted the angle. The light revealed a structure, angular, metallic, covered in a thin film of condensation. And around it, scattered across the floor of the chamber, were objects, small objects, dozens of them. Whitmore leaned closer, squinting. His stomach turned. They were shoes, children's shoes, leather Oxfords, canvas sneakers, tiny buckled Mary Janes. Some so old the stitching had rotted away, others newer, the soles barely scuffed. They lay in a rough circle around the structure, as though placed there deliberately. Fisher stepped back from the edge. "We're closing this, now." But DeWitt wasn't listening. He was staring at the structure, his face pale. "I've seen this before," he whispered. Whitmore turned to him. "What?" "Not here. Not exactly. But my grandfather, he worked construction in Clarksburg back in the 30s. He told me about a site they had to abandon. Said they dug down for a foundation and hit something they couldn't explain. Something that hummed. Foreman ordered them to fill the hole and build somewhere else." DeWitt's voice wavered. "He said they found shoes there too." The hum grew louder, splitting into harmonics again, overlapping tones that felt less like sound and more like language. Whitmore felt his teeth ache, his vision blurred, and for just a moment, he thought he saw movement at the bottom of the shaft, something shifting in the shadows beyond the flashlight's reach. He slammed the trapdoor shut. The 3 men stood in silence, breathing hard. The glow faded. The hum softened but didn't stop. "We're nailing it," Whitmore said. "Tonight." They worked quickly. Fisher drove back to his truck and returned with a toolbox and a canvas sack of 3-inch steel nails. DeWitt found scrap lumber in the storage room, thick planks left over from a roof repair 2 years prior. They laid the wood across the trapdoor in a crosshatch pattern and began to hammer. The nails went in easily at first, but halfway through, the resistance changed. Each strike felt wrong, as though the wood were pushing back, vibrating under the hammer blows. Whitmore's hands went numb. Fisher missed a strike and drove the nail through his own thumb. He didn't cry out, just pulled it free and kept working, blood dripping onto the pale green glow seeping through the seams. By 10 p.m., the trapdoor was sealed under 6 layers of oak and 47 nails. They climbed the stairs without speaking. Whitmore locked the basement door and pocketed the key. In the parking lot, under a sky finally gone dark, the 3 men stood beside their trucks and made a pact. No one would speak of what they'd seen. No one would go back down. And if anyone asked, the basement was off limits due to structural concerns. Fisher looked at Whitmore. "You think that'll hold?" Whitmore didn't answer, because the hum hadn't stopped. It was fainter now, muffled by wood and nails and denial. But it was still there, a presence beneath the church, patient and waiting. And in 3 days, the children would start asking questions. Wednesday evening service was scheduled for 7 p.m., but the children arrived an hour early, because innocence hears what adults have learned to ignore. Whitmore had hoped to cancel the midweek gathering, but Mrs. Cant reminded him that the youth choir had been rehearsing for weeks, a special performance planned for the Harvest Festival at month's end. 23 children, ages 6 to 14, all eager to practice their hymns in the sanctuary. He couldn't deny them without raising questions he wasn't prepared to answer. So he unlocked the doors at 6 p.m. and tried to pretend the basement didn't exist. The children came in clusters. Some dropped off by parents who waved from idling cars, others walking in groups from the neighborhoods along Spruce Street and Willow Avenue. They were loud in the way children always are, voices echoing off the high ceiling, shoes scuffing the floorboards as they raced toward the front pews. Whitmore stood near the altar and watched them settle. Their choir director, a thin woman named Patricia Hollis, arranging them by height and vocal range. Then, one by one, they stopped talking. It started with the youngest, a girl named Caroline Durst, barely 7 years old, pigtails tied with yellow ribbon. She stood in the front row and tilted her head, her expression shifting from curiosity to confusion. "Miss Hollis," she said quietly. "Do you hear that?" Hollis paused mid-instruction. "Hear what, sweetheart?" "The buzzing." The other children went silent. A boy in the second row, Thomas Everett, 10 years old, nodded slowly. "I hear it too. It's under the floor." Whitmore felt his chest tighten. The hum had been present all week, quieter since Monday night, but never absent. He'd grown almost accustomed to it, the way you stop noticing the hum of a refrigerator after a while. But the children, they heard it clearly. Their faces showed no fear, only focus, as though they were listening to something just beyond comprehension. "It's nothing," Whitmore said, forcing a smile. "Old building. Probably just the pipes." Caroline shook her head. "It's not pipes, it's talking." The sanctuary felt colder. Hollis clapped her hands once, trying to regain control. "All right, everyone, let's start with Amazing Grace, from the top, nice and loud." The children opened their mouths to sing. But the sound that came out was wrong. Not off-key. Wrong. The melody fractured mid-phrase, vowels elongating into tones that didn't belong in any hymn. The children's faces showed confusion, then distress, as though their own voices had become foreign instruments. One girl clutched her throat. A boy in the back row stopped singing and pressed his hands over his ears. Hollis's baton clattered to the floor. "Stop," Whitmore said. "Everyone stop." The children obeyed instantly, relief flooding their faces. Silence returned, except for the hum, which seemed louder now, almost pleased. Something was listening. Patricia Hollis bent to retrieve her baton, her hand trembling. "Reverend, I don't understand what just happened." Whitmore didn't answer. He was watching the children. They stood perfectly still, their eyes distant, unfocused. And then, without prompting, they began to move. Not all at once. One child would take a step toward the side of the sanctuary, then stop. Another would turn in place, as though pulled by an invisible thread. Caroline Durst walked slowly toward the iron grate near the wall, the one that covered the old coal chute leading down to the basement. She crouched beside it and peered through the slats. "There's light down there," she said softly. Whitmore crossed the room in 4 strides and pulled her back. "Don't look at that." She turned to face him, and her eyes were calm, empty. "It wants us to come down." He released her arm and stepped back. "What did you say?" "It's calling," she said. "Can't you hear it? It's saying names." Thomas Everett, the 10-year-old boy, spoke without turning around. "It said my brother's name." Whitmore's blood went cold. "Your brother?" "David. He died when I was 5, but I heard him down there just now. He said, 'Tommy, come see.'" 3 other children nodded in agreement. One girl, Emma Stroud, 9 years old, pointed toward the basement door at the rear of the sanctuary. "My grandma's down there too. She died last winter. I heard her singing." Patricia Hollis grabbed Whitmore's arm. "Get them out. Right now." But before Whitmore could respond, the lights flickered. Once, twice, then steady again. But in those brief moments of darkness, the glow from beneath the floor brightened, spilling through the grate in thin green tendrils. The children turned toward it as one, their faces illuminated, expressionless. Whitmore raised his voice. "Everyone outside. Now. Parents are waiting." No one moved. He stepped between the children and the grate, blocking their line of sight. "I said outside." Caroline Durst looked up at him. "It won't hurt us. It just wants to show us." "Show you what?" She smiled. A small, unsettling smile that didn't belong on a 7-year-old's face. "Where we're supposed to go." Hollis grabbed the nearest child by the shoulder and physically turned him toward the door. "Out! All of you! Move!" The spell broke. The children blinked, shook their heads as though waking from sleep, and began to file out of the sanctuary. Some looked confused. Others wouldn't meet Whitmore's eyes. Within 5 minutes, the building was empty except for the Reverend and the choir director. Hollis leaned against the back pew, her face pale. "Thomas, what the hell is down there?" "I don't know." "You're lying." He was. But how could he explain that he'd seen a shaft descending into impossible depths? That there were children's shoes arranged around something metallic and wrong? That 3 grown men had nailed a door shut rather than face what lay beneath? Instead, he said, "Cancel all youth services until further notice. People will ask why. Tell them the building isn't safe." Hollis stared at him for a long moment, then nodded and left without another word. Whitmore stood alone in the sanctuary. The hum continued, patient and rhythmic. He walked to the basement door and tested the lock. Still secure. He descended the stairs and checked the trapdoor. The planks were intact, the nails still driven deep. But as he turned to leave, he noticed something new. Scratches, fresh gouges in the wood, as though something beneath had dragged claws or fingernails across the underside of the boards. He knelt and ran his hand over the marks. They were warm to the touch. And from below, muffled but distinct, came the sound of a child laughing. Whitmore ran. He locked the basement door behind him, locked the sanctuary, locked the outer doors. He sat in his car in the empty parking lot and watched the building through the windshield, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. The lights inside the church flickered once more. And in the windows, just for a moment, he saw small silhouettes standing in rows, children who shouldn't be there, watching him with eyes that glowed pale green. When he blinked, they were gone. But the laughter continued. Martin DeWitt called Whitmore at 2:17 a.m. on Friday morning, and the first words out of his mouth were, "My daughter saw them." Because some warnings come too late, and some watchers become the watched. Whitmore had been awake. He hadn't slept properly since Monday, hadn't dared to close his eyes for more than an hour at a time. He sat at his kitchen table with cold coffee and parish records spread before him, searching for answers that refused to appear. When the phone rang, he knew before answering that the news would be bad. DeWitt's voice was tight, controlled in the way men sound when they're holding back panic. "Sarah woke me up an hour ago. Said there were children standing in our yard. Just standing there looking at the house." "How many?" "She said 5, maybe 6. I went outside with a flashlight. There was nobody there. But Thomas, the grass was pressed down, like they'd been standing in a circle." Whitmore closed his eyes. "Did she recognize any of them?" A pause. "She said one looked like the Everett boy. The dead one. David." "Where is she now?" "In her room with the door locked. She won't come out." DeWitt's voice dropped to a whisper. "What did we let out of that hole?" Whitmore had no answer. He told DeWitt to keep his family inside, keep the doors locked, and call if anything else happened. Then he hung up and sat in the dark, listening to the silence of his empty house. But it wasn't silent. Not really. If he concentrated, if he let his mind go quiet, he could hear it, the hum, faint but persistent, as though it had followed him home from the church, as though distance didn't matter anymore. By dawn, 3 more calls had come in. Harold Fisher reported that his grandson, a boy of 8 who'd been in the youth choir, had sleepwalked for the first time in his life, walking straight to the front door and trying to unlock it while still asleep. When Fisher woke him, the boy said he'd been dreaming about singing in a place with green light and no ceiling. Mrs. Eleanor Cant called to say that her neighbor's dog had been barking at the church building all night, facing the structure from 2 blocks away, refusing to be silenced or brought inside. And Patricia Hollis, who lived just 3 streets from St. Michael's, reported that every clock in her house had stopped at exactly 3:42 a.m. Whitmore dressed and drove to the church as the sun rose over Morgantown, painting the sky in shades of rust and ash. The building looked the same as always: white clapboard siding, peaked roof, brass cross gleaming above the entrance. But the air around it felt different, thicker, watching. He unlocked the main doors and stepped inside. The hum greeted him immediately, louder than before, no longer trying to hide. It vibrated through the pews, resonated in the hollow spaces behind the walls. Whitmore walked down the center aisle and stopped at the iron grate. The pale green glow was visible even in daylight, pulsing slowly beneath the slats. He had a choice. He could walk away, lock the doors, condemn the building, tell the congregation that St. Michael's was closing permanently due to structural failure. Let the diocese handle it. Let someone else make the decisions. But the children had heard their names. The dead had spoken through the floor. And whatever was down there wasn't finished. You don't abandon what you've unleashed. Whitmore unlocked the basement door and descended. The trapdoor remained sealed, the planks intact, but the scratches had multiplied. Dozens of them now, crisscrossing the wood in patterns that almost resembled letters. He knelt and tried to read them, but his eyes wouldn't focus, the shapes shifting whenever he looked directly at them. From beneath the boards came a sound, not the hum, but something else. A voice, high and clear, singing in perfect pitch. Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty. A child's voice, and then another joined it, and another, until a full choir sang from below, their harmonies impossibly beautiful, impossibly wrong. Whitmore stood and backed toward the stairs. The singing grew louder, more insistent, and he realized with sick certainty that he recognized some of the voices. Children who'd been at Wednesday's practice, children who were supposed to be safe at home. He ran upstairs and locked the basement door. His hands shook as he dialed DeWitt's number. We need to go back down there tonight, all three of us. DeWitt was silent for a moment. Why? Because it's getting stronger. Because it's reaching the children. Because if we don't stop it now, we won't get another chance. Stop it how? Whitmore looked at the locked door, at the light seeping beneath it. I don't know yet, but we can't just nail it shut again. That evening, as the sun set and the sky turned the color of deep water, 3 men gathered once more in the church parking lot. This time they came prepared. Flashlights, rope, a battery-powered lantern, and something else. A jerry can of kerosene and a box of matches, carried by Fisher without explanation or objection from the others. They entered through the side door. The sanctuary was empty, but it didn't feel empty. There was a presence in the air, an attention focused on them as they moved through the building. The hum had become almost musical, shifting between tones like a choir warming up. Whitmore led them down to the basement. The trapdoor waited, its surface now covered almost entirely with scratches. The green glow spilled through every seam, bright enough to cast shadows on the concrete walls. We pull it open, Whitmore said. We look at what's down there. Really look, and we figure out what it is. And then? DeWitt asked. Fisher set down the kerosene. Then we burn it. They worked quickly. The crowbar wedged into the seam, the planks splintered and came free. And this time, when they lifted the trapdoor, the singing stopped. The shaft descended into darkness, but the glow at the bottom was brighter now, illuminating the metallic structure in the chamber below. It was larger than Whitmore remembered, or perhaps it had grown. The surface was covered in geometric patterns that hurt to look at, angles that didn't quite connect, curves that folded back on themselves. And surrounding it, arranged in careful rows, were the children. Not physically, not their bodies, but their shapes, translucent, flickering, like reflections caught in dark water. 23 of them, the exact number from Wednesday's choir practice. They stood motionless, faces upturned, mouths open in silent song. DeWitt's flashlight beam swept across the chamber. Jesus Christ! They're still alive, Whitmore whispered. Somewhere. This is just pulling at them. Fisher unscrewed the cap on the kerosene can. Then we cut the line. But before he could pour, one of the shapes looked up. Not at the men, through them. And when it spoke, its voice came from everywhere at once. You opened the door. You can't close it now. The trapdoor slammed shut on its own, nearly catching Fisher's hand. The 3 men stumbled backward as the hum exploded into a roar. Not sound, but pressure, a physical force that drove them to their knees. The lights went out, and in the darkness, they heard footsteps on the stairs. Small footsteps, dozens of them, descending. The children were coming home. The flashlights died in unison, plunging the basement into absolute black, except for the green glow seeping through the trapdoor's seams. Because some things don't need light to see you, only for you to see them. Whitmore's hand found DeWitt's shoulder in the darkness, gripping hard enough to bruise. The footsteps continued down the stairs, measured, deliberate, each one landing with the weight of something that had learned to walk but hadn't quite mastered the rhythm. Fisher's breathing came in short gasps beside them, and Whitmore could smell the kerosene from the overturned can, spreading across the concrete floor in an invisible pool. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. Silence. Not even the hum remained, just a hollow absence of sound that pressed against their eardrums like deep water. Whitmore's eyes adjusted slowly to the green luminescence, and he could make out shapes now. The storage shelves, the furnace hulking in the corner, the trapdoor pulsing with light, and the children. They stood in a line across the basement, blocking the stairs, 7 of them. Small silhouettes backlit by that sickly glow, faces lost in shadow. They didn't move, didn't breathe, just stood there with a patience that felt older than stone. DeWitt's voice came out as a croak. "Those aren't the children." He was right. The proportions were wrong. Limbs too long, heads tilted at angles that necks shouldn't allow. They wore shapes like borrowed clothes, approximations of childhood stretched over frames that didn't quite fit. One of them took a step forward. Its movement was liquid, jointless. "You shouldn't have hammered," it said, and the voice belonged to Caroline Durst, the 7-year-old with yellow ribbons in her pigtails. But it came from the wrong throat, inflected with harmonics that made Whitmore's back teeth ache. "We were only listening. Now we have to show you." Fisher found his voice. "Show us what?" The thing wearing Caroline's voice tilted its head 90 degrees, where the singing goes when it stops. The other 6 shapes moved in unison, spreading out to flank the 3 men. Whitmore backed against the wall, his hand finding the cold metal of a shelf bracket. His mind raced through options. The stairs were blocked. The only window was a narrow casement near the ceiling, too small for a man to fit through. And the trapdoor behind them led only deeper into whatever nightmare had taken root beneath the church. "The children at the practice," Whitmore said, forcing his voice steady. "Where are they?" "They're real bodies." "Safe," the Caroline thing said, "sleeping, dreaming us into being." It took another step forward, and in the green light Whitmore could see its face now, or the approximation of a face, features that shifted like oil on water. "They heard us. They answered, just like the others did." "What others?" The thing smiled, and its teeth were too numerous. "The ones who left their shoes. The earth remembers what we bury." DeWitt lunged sideways, grabbing for the stairs, but 2 of the shapes moved with impossible speed and blocked his path. He stumbled back, crashing into Fisher. The kerosene smell grew stronger, vapors rising in the cold air. "You can't keep us down here forever," Fisher said. "People know we came. They'll come looking." "We don't want to keep you," the Caroline thing replied. "We want you to understand. You built your church on top of us. You sang your songs while we waited below. And now," it gestured toward the trapdoor, "now you've invited us up." One of the other shapes spoke, and this voice belonged to Thomas Everett, the 10-year-old boy who'd heard his dead brother calling. "We've been here longer than your town, longer than your roads. We were here when the first people came, and we'll be here when the last ones leave." Whitmore's fingers closed around the shelf bracket, working it loose from the wood. "What are you?" We're the spaces between songs, the Caroline thing said. The silence where hymns used to be. Your children opened doors in their throats when they tried to sing, and we walked through. The bracket came free in Whitmore's hand, a 2-foot length of iron with a sharp corner. Not much of a weapon, but something. He gripped it like a club and stepped forward. Let us pass. The shapes didn't move, but the green light from the trapdoor suddenly flared brighter, and Whitmore heard it again, the singing from below, that perfect choir of stolen voices rising through the wood. And this time he understood the words. They were singing backwards, Latin hymns reversed, syllables inverted, creating sounds that predated language. The air grew colder. Frost formed on the concrete walls in branching patterns that looked almost like writing, and the 7 shapes began to change, their borrowed forms dissolving, revealing what moved beneath. Whitmore couldn't look directly at them. His eyes slid away, refusing to process the geometry of their true shapes. Things with too many angles, surfaces that folded through dimensions he couldn't name. He swung the bracket blindly, felt it connect with something that yielded like wet clay, and then snapped back with force that sent him sprawling. Fisher grabbed the lantern, still dead, useless, and hurled it at the nearest shape. It passed through the thing without resistance and shattered against the wall. "The kerosene!" DeWitt shouted. "Thomas! The matches!" Whitmore's hand went to his pocket, fingers closing around the matchbox he'd forgotten he was carrying. Fisher had brought the fuel, but Whitmore had brought fire, a habit from years of lighting altar candles. He scrambled to his feet, struck a match against the box. The shapes recoiled. It was subtle, just a slight backward movement, a hesitation. But it was there. The match flame, ordinary yellow fire, made them pause. "They don't like it," Whitmore said. "Real light, not their glow." He struck another match and held both flames before him like a ward. The shapes drew back farther, reforming into their child approximations as though retreating into more defensible forms. Fisher understood immediately. He pulled a lighter from his jacket, a battered Zippo, fuel reservoir still half full. He flicked it open, spun the wheel, and flame bloomed in his palm. The Caroline thing hissed. "You would burn your own church?" "If it means burning you out of it," Fisher said, "yes." The 3 men moved together, flames held high, backing the shapes toward the trapdoor. The reversed singing from below grew frantic, discordant. The green glow pulsed wildly, and cracks began to appear in the concrete floor, thin fissures spreading from the trapdoor like spider webs. "You can't destroy us," the Thomas thing said, its voice fracturing into multiple tones. "We're already everywhere the children dreamed us, in their homes, in their sleep." "You opened the door, Reverend, the door in their voices." Whitmore's match burned down to his fingers. He dropped it and struck another. "Then we'll wake them up." The shapes lunged forward all at once, and Fisher dropped his lighter into the pool of kerosene. The basement erupted in flame, blue-white fire racing across the concrete, climbing the wooden stairs, catching on the old papers stacked against the walls. The shapes screamed, a sound that wasn't sound but pressure, and their forms came apart like smoke and wind. "Go!" Whitmore shoved DeWitt toward the stairs. The 3 men ran through the wall of fire, feeling the heat singe their clothes, their hair. Behind them, the trapdoor splintered, not from the fire, but from something pushing up from below. They reached the sanctuary and didn't stop running. Out the side door, into the parking lot, into their trucks. Whitmore looked back once and saw flames visible through the church windows and silhouettes moving within them, small shapes dancing in the burning light. The fire department arrived 19 minutes later, but by then the church was lost. And in 23 homes across Morgantown, children woke from troubled sleep and began to scream. By dawn on Saturday, September 19th, 1970, every child who'd attended Wednesday's choir practice had been admitted to Morgantown General Hospital. Because some fevers don't break, and some dreams refuse to end when you open your eyes. The call came to Whitmore at 6:43 a.m. He'd been sitting in his car outside the smoldering ruins of St. Michael's, watching firefighters douse the last stubborn flames, when Mrs. Cant reached him on the Jachim radio phone. Her voice was steady but hollow, the tone of someone delivering news they haven't fully processed. "Thomas, you need to get to the hospital. It's the children. All of them." He arrived to find the pediatric ward in chaos. Parents in the hallways, doctors moving between rooms with faces that betrayed their confusion, nurses wheeling equipment he couldn't identify. Patricia Hollis stood near the admission desk, still wearing her nightgown under a hastily thrown-on coat. When she saw Whitmore, her expression hardened. "They're calling it mass hysteria," she said. "Group psychosis, but the doctors can't explain the burns." "Burns?" She led him to the first room. Through the window, he could see Caroline Durst lying in a hospital bed, her mother seated beside her, holding the girl's hand. Caroline's eyes were open but unfocused, staring at something on the ceiling that no one else could see. And on her palms, clearly visible even from the hallway, were marks. Not burns from fire, but patterns. Geometric scorch marks etched into her skin. The same impossible angles Whitmore had seen on the structure beneath the church. "Every one of them has marks," Hollis said quietly. "Different patterns, but all the same type of wound. And they all woke up at exactly 3:42 a.m. The same time every clock in her house had stopped 2 nights ago." Whitmore moved from window to window, looking into each room. Thomas Everett, Emma Stroud, 17 others whose names he knew from attendance sheets and baptismal records. All awake, all staring, all marked. Some were crying silently. Others hummed fragments of hymns that didn't quite resolve into recognizable melodies. Dr. Raymond Casper, the hospital's chief pediatrician, a man of 53 who delivered half the babies in Morgantown, intercepted Whitmore in the corridor. "Reverend, I need you to tell me what happened in that church. There was a fire. That's not what I'm asking." Casper pulled him into an empty consultation room and closed the door. These children all presented with identical symptoms: elevated core temperature, dilated pupils, skin markings that don't match any known pathology. When we try to question them, they respond, but not to us. They're answering questions we didn't ask, addressing people who aren't in the room. He lowered his voice. "And 3 of them have started speaking languages they couldn't possibly know." "What languages?" Dr. Monroe from the university identified fragments of Latin and Greek, but also sounds that don't correspond to any documented language. Casper fixed Whitmore with a hard stare. What were those children exposed to? Whitmore's mind raced. The truth would sound insane, would get him committed to the psychiatric ward 3 floors down, but lies wouldn't help the children. Something underneath the church, something old. It used their voices. Casper studied him for a long moment. "You're serious?" "Completely." "Then how do we stop it?" "You can't kill what was never alive." The answer came from an unexpected source. Martin DeWitt arrived at the hospital just after 9 a.m., his daughter Sarah in tow. She wasn't among the afflicted. She'd stayed home Wednesday evening, kept away by a convenient fever that now seemed like providence. But she carried something with her, a leather-bound journal, pages yellowed with age, that she'd found in her grandfather's attic that morning. Grandpa was part of the crew in Clarksburg, DeWitt explained, guiding Whitmore and Casper to a quiet corner of the waiting room. The construction job he told me about. I remembered he kept records, daily logs of the site work. Sarah and I went looking. Sarah opened the journal to a page marked with ribbon. The entry was dated June 7th, 1934, written in neat cursive. Reached depth of 22 feet today. Drills hit something solid. Not bedrock, surface is too smooth, almost metallic. Foreman says we dig around it. But after lunch, Morrison's boy came running up from the pit screaming, says he heard singing. We all climbed down to listen. Nothing at first. Then Patterson heard it too. Then me. Children's voices, clear as church bells, coming from beneath the metal, singing backwards. We pulled everyone out. Foreman ordered the pit filled by morning. Found 7 pairs of shoes at the bottom, small ones. No bodies, just shoes. Whitmore's hands trembled as he held the journal. There were shoes under our church, too, in the chamber. That's not all, Sarah said softly. She flipped forward several pages. Grandpa kept tracking it. Other sites, other towns. The entries painted a pattern across West Virginia. Construction projects abandoned, wells sealed, basements condemned. Always the same story. Workers digging down, finding something that hummed and glowed, hearing voices of children long dead or never born. And always, shoes left behind, like offerings or warnings. It's not isolated to your church, DeWitt said. It's underneath multiple sites, like a network. Or one large thing, Casper added, with multiple access points. Whitmore looked at the doctor. You believe us? I believe something is affecting these children, and I believe conventional medicine won't help them. He paused. What did you do to the access point under your church? We burned it, the whole building, and the trapdoor, the shaft. Collapsed in the fire, I assume. The floor caved in. Sarah shook her head. Fire won't kill it. Grandpa wrote that they tried burning the structure in Clarksburg. It just reflected the flames back. They had to bury it under 30 feet of concrete and build somewhere else. Whitmore felt the weight of understanding settle over him. So we didn't destroy it. We just made it angry. From down the hall came a sound that froze everyone in place. 23 children singing in perfect unison, their voices carrying through closed doors and walls. Not a hymn, not a song, just a single sustained note that vibrated through the building's foundation. The fluorescent lights flickered. Cracks appeared in the linoleum floor, spreading from the pediatric ward like veins. Dr. Casper grabbed Whitmore's arm. Whatever you need to do, do it now. But Whitmore was already running, DeWitt and Sarah close behind. They burst into Caroline Durst's room to find the girl sitting upright in bed, eyes rolled back white, the geometric marks on her palms glowing with that familiar pale green light. Her mother had backed into the corner, terrified. Caroline, Whitmore said, kneeling beside the bed. Can you hear me? The girl's head turned toward him, but the movement was wrong, too smooth, too controlled. When she spoke, it was with that layered voice, multiple tones woven together. You burned our door, so we made new ones. New doors where? Caroline's hand lifted, fingers pointing toward her own throat. Here, where the singing starts. And Whitmore understood. The children weren't possessed or infected. They had become the doors. Their voices, opened by song, had created pathways. and burning the church had simply forced whatever was below to find another route up. "Then we closed the doors," he said. "How?" DeWitt demanded. Sarah held up the journal. "Grandpa wrote one more thing, about the Clarksburg site. Before they sealed it, they brought in a priest, not to bless it, to bind it. Old words, older than Latin." "Did he write them down?" She turned to the final page. The handwriting here was shakier, as though written in haste or fear. Lines of text in a language Whitmore didn't recognize. Sharp consonants, guttural vowels, words that seemed to resist being read aloud. "It's a sealing rite," Sarah said. "Grandpa called it speaking the silence." The children's sustained note grew louder, more insistent. Windows cracked. Medical equipment sparked and died. And through the walls, Whitmore heard other voices joining. Not the patients, but echoes from below, from the network of shafts and chambers spreading beneath the town like roots. He took the journal from Sarah's hands. "Everyone out," he ordered. "Clear the ward. Get the children's families away from them." "You can't go in there alone," DeWitt protested. "I'm not going in. I'm staying out here." Whitmore looked at the 23 doors lining the corridor. "I'm going to sing them shut." He began to read. The words tasted like iron and ash on Whitmore's tongue, syllables that wanted to reverse themselves mid-utterance. Because some languages weren't meant for human mouths, and some songs can only be sung once. He stood in the center of the pediatric ward corridor, the journal trembling in his hands, and began to speak the words his eyes barely comprehended. Around him, nurses and orderlies ushered terrified parents toward the exits, their protests fading as DeWitt and Casper physically guided them away. Through the windows of 23 rooms, 23 children sat, upright in their beds, heads tilted at identical angles, mouths open in that endless droning note. The words in the journal wanted to be sung, not spoken. Whitmore could feel that instinctively. But he wasn't trained in the old ways, didn't know the melodies that might have accompanied these ancient phrases. So he did the only thing he could. He chanted them in the rhythm of the hymns he'd learned as a boy, wrapping the alien syllables in familiar cadences. The effect was immediate. The children's sustained note wavered, fractured. The green glow pulsing from their marked palms flickered like candles in wind. And from somewhere below, deep beneath the hospital's foundation, beneath the streets of Morgantown, beneath the burned skeleton of St. Michael's, came a sound like grinding stone. Not the hum, not the singing, something older, angrier. Caroline Durst's head snapped toward him, and when she spoke, her voice was purely other now, not even pretending to be the 7-year-old girl. "You speak the binding words, but you don't understand them. You're sealing doorways while standing inside the house." Whitmore continued reading, louder now. His throat burned. Each syllable scraped against his vocal cords like broken glass. But he pushed through the pain, forcing out the next line and the next. The floor beneath his feet cracked. Not just hairline fractures, deep splits that revealed darkness below. And within that darkness, movement. Shapes rising. The things that had worn children's forms in the church basement, now countless, climbing toward the surface through fissures in bedrock and concrete. Sarah appeared at his elbow, ignoring DeWitt's shouts for her to evacuate. She held her grandfather's journal open, finger tracing the lines to help him keep his place. "You have to finish the full verse," she said urgently. "All 9 stanzas. Grandpa wrote that stopping mid-binding only makes them stronger." 9 stanzas. Whitmore had completed 2. His voice was already failing. In the rooms, the children began to convulse. Not seizures, but something else. Their bodies arched, spines bending at angles that should have shattered vertebrae. The geometric marks on their skin spread, crawling up their arms, across their necks, reaching toward their faces. And through their open mouths, that pale green glow intensified, as though something were trying to push through from the inside out. The doors were opening wider. Thomas Everett's mother broke free from the evacuation line and ran back into the ward, screaming her son's name. She reached his room and grabbed the door handle. Whitmore shouted for her to stop, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of cracking foundations. She yanked the door open and rushed inside. The boy's eyes focused on her, truly focused, for the first time since waking. "Mom?" His real voice. Young, scared, human. She sobbed and reached for him, pulling him into an embrace. "I'm here, baby. I'm here." And the thing inside him smiled with his mouth. The marks on Thomas's skin flared bright, and the glow transferred, leaping from his body to his mother's like electrical current. She staggered back, releasing him, staring at her hands as geometric patterns burned themselves into her palms. Her scream was cut short as the droning note began to pour from her throat. The door had found a new anchor. No. Whitmore abandoned the reading and lunged for the room, but DeWitt caught him, held him back. "You can't help her," DeWitt said, voice breaking. "You stop reading, we lose everyone. Finish it." Whitmore watched in horror as Mrs. Everett collapsed beside her son's bed, the two of them caught in the same seizure state, both glowing from within. He wanted to run to them, to do something, but DeWitt was right. 22 other children still had a chance. He returned to the center of the corridor, found his place in the journal, and continued. Stanza 3 came easier. The words had begun to make a terrible kind of sense, forming patterns in his mind like music written in mathematics. He could feel the binding taking hold, reality solidifying around the syllables, sealing the gaps through which the things below were trying to climb. The children's bodies relaxed slightly. The convulsions lessened. But the marks continued to spread, racing against the completion of the rite. Stanza 4. His voice was nearly gone now, reduced to a harsh whisper. Sarah stayed beside him, reading the words aloud with him, her young voice clear where his faltered. Together they wove the binding, 2 voices where there should have been one, and somehow it worked. The rhythm held, the power accumulated. The hospital's walls began to shake, not from earthquake but from pressure. Massive force pushing up from below, concentrated now on this single point of resistance. Ceiling tiles fell. Water pipes burst, flooding the corridor with ice-cold water that steamed where it touched the cracks in the floor. Stanza 5. 6. The words came faster now, demanding speed, as though the binding itself knew time was running out. Whitmore could feel his consciousness fragmenting, part of him here in the hospital, part of him somewhere else, seeing through stone and soil to the vast network beneath. Miles of tunnels. Chambers filled with relics of things that had called this land home long before towns had names. And at the center, something massive and patient, stirring for the first time in centuries. It had been waiting. The churches, the construction sites, the wells, they'd all been minor disturbances, easily ignored. But now, with doors opening in human throats, with voices creating pathways, it could finally move. Stanza 7. The children began to speak with him, not the layered voices of possession, but their own voices, weak and confused, joining the binding chant without understanding why. Caroline, Emma, 17 others, reclaiming their throats one syllable at a time. Only Thomas. Everett remained silent, still tangled with his mother in the feedback loop of transferred possession. Stanza 8. The green glow in the corridor began to fade, replaced by ordinary light. Harsh, fluorescent bulbs fighting to illuminate a reality that was slowly, painfully, re-solidifying. The cracks in the floor stopped spreading. The shapes climbing through them retreated, pulled back by the weight of the words. But Thomas Everett's mother was dying. Whitmore could see it. Her body couldn't sustain what was pouring through her. She'd taken the door meant for her son, and it was killing her. He had one stanza left, 9 lines, and a choice. He could finish the binding, seal all the doors, and watch her die. Or he could break the pattern, try to redirect the binding to save her, and risk losing everyone. Sarah grabbed his arm. "Don't stop, please, my grandpa wrote..." She pointed to a note scrawled in the margin. "Some doors can only be closed from the inside." From the inside. Whitmore looked at Thomas Everett's room, at the boy and his mother locked in their terrible embrace, and he understood. He walked to the doorway, still chanting, never breaking the rhythm. Sarah followed, holding the journal open. Together they entered the room, stepping through the threshold that marked the boundary between world and doorway. Inside, the air was different, thicker, colder, tasting of copper and distant thunder. Mrs. Everett lay on the floor, barely breathing. Thomas knelt beside her, tears streaming down his face, his small hands pressed against the marks on her palms. Whitmore knelt across from the boy and placed his own hands over theirs, his flesh touching the geometric burns, feeling the current of wrong energy flowing between them. He spoke the final stanza directly into the connection, letting the words travel through skin and blood and bone. The binding closed like a fist. Mrs. Everett gasped, one sharp, desperate inhalation, and the green glow extinguished. The marks on her skin faded to pale scars. She collapsed, unconscious but breathing. In the corridor, 22 children slumped back into their beds, the possession broken, the doors sealed. But Thomas Everett still glowed. The boy looked up at Whitmore, and his eyes were his own, clear, terrified, aware. "Reverend, I can still hear them. They're still inside." Because someone had to hold the door shut. Someone had to stand at the threshold and refuse to move. Whitmore pulled the boy close. "Then we listen together, and we don't let them through." He stayed in that room for 3 days and 3 nights, holding Thomas Everett while doctors and nurses worked around them, while the boy shook with effort, while the marks on his skin pulsed and faded and pulsed again. Whitmore sang every hymn he knew, then sang them backward, then sang them in the binding language until his voice was gone entirely. On the 4th day, the boy's fever broke. The marks became scars, the glow died. And, when asked what he remembered, Thomas Everett said only, "Someone was singing to me from under the ground. They wanted me to sing back, but Reverend Whitmore sang louder." The hospital released all 23 children within a week. Mrs. Everett recovered fully, with no memory of what had happened in her son's room. The ruins of St. Michael's were bulldozed and the site sealed under concrete, officially listed as condemned due to unstable foundation, which was, in its own way, perfectly true. But sometimes, on quiet nights, residents of Morgantown report hearing children singing, not from any church or school, but from below, from basements and wells and storm drains. A choir of voices that starts and stops at 3:42 a.m., And in 23 homes across town, children wake from dreams they can't quite remember and find new geometric scars on their palms that weren't there when they went to sleep. The doors were sealed, but beneath West Virginia, in chambers that predate memory, something vast and patient continues to hum, waiting for the next voice to answer, waiting for the next door to open, listening for the sound of singing. Some say Martin DeWitt still drives past the sealed site every Sunday morning, checking to make sure the concrete hasn't cracked. Others claim Sarah keeps her grandfather's journal locked in a safe deposit box, refusing all requests to publish its contents. And if you ask Reverend Thomas Whitmore, who moved to a new parish in Pennsylvania shortly after, he'll tell you he doesn't sing anymore, not even in the shower. Just in case something beneath the earth mistakes it for an invitation, we're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.